We are the last panel. We are the obstacle to the breakout rooms and the wine. So I'm going to do a quick sense check in the room. I do healthcare tech investments in the Midwest. I'm based in Chicago. How many of you would position the Midwest as a healthcare epicenter? Show of hands. Thank you, Mark. So actually, the Midwest is the hotbed of the healthcare industry in the US. And as my French accent will tell, being an outsider, I love data, I look at data. So let's look at data. If you take the FTSE 500 companies and you look at the healthcare names in there, it's about 100 names. A third of them are headquartered, drivable distance from Chicago. A third of them. So if you are a healthcare tech company, a startup, trying to break through a $3.6 trillion industry, which is primarily driven by payers, hospitals, distributors, pharmacies, consumers at best will pay out of pocket 5 to 7% of the healthcare size. So healthcare tech has to be next to its customers, and its customers are in the Midwest. Yet, if we look at early stage healthcare tech funding last year for the entire Midwest, it was less than 7%. So that creates a huge opportunity to drive investments behind well-positioned companies that are close to their customers. And there's talent and a great university, so the quality of innovation is really high. Just wanted to kick us off a little bit on what we do at Pace Healthcare Capital. My background, I have spent 12 of the last 16 years investing in healthcare. The bulk of my career was in private equity, where I have invested over $1 billion of capital with great returns. So I used to fly to the Midwest all the time for my private equity deals, only to find out how much early stage there is. Before I pass on to my co-panelists tonight, I'd like to add a note. We think of healthcare as a priority area for impact investments. But all healthcare deals aren't always impact-oriented. So how do we think about driving impact in the space? And it comes down to three pillars. One is, how do we drive patient outcomes? How do we actually improve patients' health? The second is, how do we decrease cost? How do we make it more accessible? How do we treat more people with less resources? And the last one is, how do we expand access? In this country, still 10% of the population does not have healthcare insurance, pays out of pocket. That creates a barrier to access. There are also telecom deserts where people cannot actually access telemedicine. So these are the three pillars behind which we invest, and we will filter opportunities through that scorecard. And I was really energized by seeing today just how much energy there is to drive impact on causes as noble as human trafficking, prison education. Healthcare should be the next place to look into. We really have a lot to talk about. I'll stop there, move on.
Hi, my name is Ari Kaufman. I introduced myself yesterday, but I'll just quickly say I'm the CEO of a startup called Spout. And we've got a product that measures and detects lead in drinking water in the home. I'm not here to talk about that, obviously. One of the things about impact tech, if you will, is the breakdown and the ability to prove the impact. And I think that's sort of one of the real fundamental flaws that's coming out of innovation. People know what a DALI is, disability. Sorry, I always forget the actual word. Disability adjusted life years. So the idea is, like for what I do is the impact of people drinking water with lead, right? So all the things that lead does to people, whether it's brain damage or heart or liver or kidney, all the things. So when you take all together the things that happen from people that ingest lead around the world, 24 million years are lost of life. Right? That's a DALY. So when you try to think about impact, what is my company trying to do? We're trying to eliminate 24 million years a year in lost life. And so that's where we take, so if we can eliminate lead in drinking water, how many heart attacks do we prevent? How many developing brains can we help? And that's not just brain damage, that's ADD, that's all the things that are resulting from lead. But you can actually draw together the DALY that you're saving. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do, not just say we're removing lead service lines, but it's, 68% of the intellectual disability that's happening around the world is related to the ingestion of lead. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do for family funds and for the investors, to show the impact is much greater than just saving 22 million kids, but it's saving, millions and tens of millions of lives a year from all the ancillary impacts that something has. And I think that's a fundamental flaw that impact tech is not getting challenged to do. It's not getting challenged by investors, by family funds, and saying, well, show me my impact. Give me quantitative understanding so I can go back to my family and say, this is what we did. This is what we're doing. And I think it's a flaw. So anyway.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Appel, the CEO of Orange Grove Bio. I'm not going to tell you a lot about my business today, because I think most of you are here trying to learn more broadly about perhaps the healthcare industry or ways you might think about investing. Instead, I'll sort of help to dispel kind of two myths, and I think one of them builds well upon a point made just a minute ago by one of my co-panelists. The first one is that opportunity in healthcare resides mostly in the coasts and probably disproportionately in Boston and San Francisco. And I think it's a great point that most of the large healthcare companies in this country are actually located in the middle of the country between the coasts. I think it kind of speaks to the fact that there's a lot going on that maybe is drifting under the radar of most of the venture capital industry, most of the family offices, and actually prices are lower, returns are higher on those opportunities in the middle of the country, just as a general rule. If you look across all of PitchBook and you compare the data, it's pretty stark contrast. Additionally, just in terms of the amount of research dollars spent, right? Where does the NIH put most of its money? There's a far more big research institutions between the coasts than there are on the coasts. And so actually more of your research dollars, all of our taxpayer dollars, are going to research in the middle of the country. Most of that actually is spent on drug and device development. And so if you're thinking about where can you actually invest in stuff at a lower price, have a greater impact, you're probably going to do it, be wise to at least spend some time thinking between the coasts. And that's one of the reasons actually our firm has spent a lot of time looking at opportunities in the middle of the country. A second myth that I kind of wanted to dispel really is close to my heart, because I spend most of my time investing in the therapeutics world and building opportunities in the drug development world. And that's that drug development is inherently super high risk and takes an extremely long time, and as a result, you can never make money in it, right? I think that historically, there was a time where that was the case. If you had to go ahead and invest in something kind of out of an academic lab, and you were going to go and build that thing up and develop that drug all the way until it got to patients in the market, you were talking about a 15-year timeline. I'd say, outside of maybe the bravest of investors, that was a very hard thing to do, and it was a binary outcome at the end of the day, and that's something that a lot of people had a hard time embracing. The biotech community has matured a lot. And I think there's really two big changes. One is the fact that you can actually select what stage of drug development you want to invest in. So there's a strategy which inherently is becoming much more common in the biotech industry to invest in early and get out early. And that's actually very, very helpful, because it means you're able to take on certain stages of risk, but not take on the risk of the full drug development cycle. That's why a lot of biotech venture funds have gotten significant outperformance, really, of most other types of investing. advancing over the past decade. There's really been this shift where you can get in early, you can actually exit to the public markets at a very early stage. Tied to all of that is the fact that if you position yourself in the correct way, in the right stages, and in the right types of drug development, you could also minimize risk. You could also invest in what are called platform plays, and that was something that was not really an area of being able to invest in drugs historically. You would invest in one product, it would work or it wouldn't work. Now there's an idea of, can I invest in an area of science that has multiple potential pathways to market, and if one piece of that fails, many of the other pieces may still be successful, and usually there's some underlying science that's pretty well established that kind of de-risks it. And so you're seeing a big transition in the biotech industry from what I would call high risk, long time frame binary outcomes to you kind of pick where you play, and you can actually do quite well by selecting where you play in the industry. Where we've chosen to play, just quickly give the view as to what Orange Grove is, and we're essentially at that earliest stage of development. So we've chosen to focus on programs coming out of academia and developing them through what's called preclinical development and into early clinical development. I will tell you, late preclinical development has about a 70% chance of succeeding. Most of the risks there are manufacturing. It's not actually the drug risks that we normally associate with drug development. Phase 1 trials have about a 60-something% success rate as well. These are just really across the whole industry. So you multiply those together, your success rates are actually pretty high as long as you aren't staying for those later stages of drug development and you aren't getting involved in essentially quote-unquote academic research that right now is being funded by the government. So if you kind of pick the stages you play, and others choose to play in other later stages, if you're just playing sort of a single area, stage of development, the risks there can be quite manageable, right? You can get in early, get out early. You can come in later, get out later. And there's multiple different strategies that can work. We've kind of chosen our place, and so far so good. But I just wanted to dispel some of the general, I think maybe misinformation that people have about kind of healthcare investing.
So are there actually any questions? I can take you on to venturing in some of the investments we've made. But I also would like to make sure the talk is relevant to any concerns or areas you may be spending into. Any questions about healthcare or things you are particularly interested in? No. How many have lost a loved one to sepsis? How many know what sepsis is? Okay, so good knowledge base. So sepsis, sometimes defined as a blood infection, more often defined as a hyperbolic response of the immune system. It's the leading cause of mortality in hospitals. Mortality rate is as high as 50% once patients deteriorate, and the ones who do survive, unfortunately, in the process of having sepsis, often have their blood vessels constricting, which lead to amputation. Terrible, terrible syndrome. The diagnostic industry has spent the last 30 years trying to find a biomarker that tells what's going on with the patient before they actually become septic. The challenge is when a patient is septic, at the beginning, at the onset of the symptoms, they have very few things. It's going to be an elevated temperature. It's going to be an elevated heart rate. Actually, one of the chief complaints when they walk into the ED is belly pain. Very undifferentiated. They could be having appendicitis or a whole host of things. But once patients deteriorate, it unravels really fast. It's very difficult to treat them. Antibiotics aren't enough, hence mortality rate. As a consequence, it's also one of the leading causes of malpractice lawsuits against emergency room doctors, because it's one of the easiest places to say, well, you missed it. Well, it was so early, how could we tell? We found an entrepreneur that took the decision to say, before we actually diagnose sepsis or try to figure out a biomarker, we gotta understand the patients. And went on a journey of accumulating data, actually 55,000 blood samples, over 11,000 patients, full electronic health records. It took 10 years to build, to just understand what sepsis patients are, and found that actually there are 10 different subgroups of patients. So my sepsis reactions will be different from Mark's, will be different from yours. And we first have to understand what goes on inside their body. With this, he found out, he thought, let me develop a hardware, a reagent, diagnostics, that's what we do. He found out actually his software performs better alone. That means much lower costs. If you try to develop and deploy hardware, reagent, sort of razor blade model in hospitals, usually a test costs between $500 and $5,000 per test. And that's where the market for sepsis diagnosis is today, with no actual answer. With software, we're in the low double digits. So with that model, we've not only improved patient outcomes by being able to detect sepsis much earlier through software, diagnostic as a software, we've also meaningfully decreased costs because we're able to price a diagnostic tool at about 1/10 of the lowest price competitor. That's also how we expand access. Oh, thank you. No, actually, I prefer it. Never mind. That biobank, that amount of data, is now creating a number of other products. We can look at people that have myocardial infarction. We can look at people that have acute kidney injuries, similar onsets of indications. It's hard to tell early when a patient is about to deteriorate, but the data and the information is inside their body. Once they do, it's really just hard to turn around. And so it's an example of places where if we take our filter of thinking through, well, it's a medical diagnostic. I, as a fund, don't do FDA-approved products. It's binary. Well, no. This business has actually revenues. They've been able to monetize their data, and they've actually been able to survive really well, in addition to developing a product that's revolutionizing the detection of sepsis. So the point I'm trying to drive here is there are many underserved areas in terms of capital in healthcare, where if we try to follow the traditional VC template, I do FDA approval, I don't do FDA approval, I do diagnostics, I don't do diagnostics, I do software, is it diagnostic? We're gonna miss opportunities. When we came across this entrepreneur with my fund, the first thing we did was to reach out to actually emergency room doctors, chief medical officer of Team Health. It's a very large business, a $6 billion company actually, who called Kevin and said, hey Kevin, I think we've got something really differentiated for your doctors, but it's technical, can you come take a look at this with us? So this is the next thing. Let me come on and stay on. And with this, we've actually built a movement to try to help the entrepreneur get to the next level. But it takes tailored and crafted capital to make this happen. This is where actually many family offices have a differentiated role to play, because you will look at each opportunity for what it is, for where it stands, for the type of risk it represents, for the upside, yes, a return, as well as how can we drive patient outcomes, decrease costs, expand access. And this is in those areas, actually, that I think we all ought to spend more time discussing how can we support the best entrepreneurs in healthcare tech of tomorrow. Because the VC model doesn't identify them, and they're really there to drive the difference.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here, I'll also open with a question, maybe one that you're not expecting. How many of you have played Pac-Man, the video game? There we go. That's so I'm gonna tell you a little story about how actually learnings from Pac-Man have actually helped us save lives for patients. And I think it's one of the more fun stories that we've had within our business. So I don't know if many of you have heard the term cytokine storm. It was, I'd say, not a very household name prior to COVID, and COVID unfortunately has made it much more of a household name. It's essentially when immune cells in your body get really excited and they keep building up in an area until they eventually cause tissue death, right? And it happens a lot in the lungs, and that results in patients not being able to breathe, ending up on ventilators. Has existed, by the way, long before COVID was ever around, right? The acute respiratory distress is the generalized condition caused by pneumonia, caused by flu, caused by lots of things. Clearly, even before COVID, it was something that was killing over 1 million people every year around the world. What people hadn't really understood for a long time is the immune cells that were actually causing this disease, and actually many other diseases, are basically like little round balls that go around your bloodstream. Sorry, I'm maybe oversimplifying, but it really is what they're doing. And they basically identify harmful pathogens in your body, and they gobble them up, right? They basically open their mouths like Pac-Man. If you look at them under a microscope, that's what it looks like. And they gobble up particles. You feel like you're watching them grabbing the little yellow balls and going around the bloodstream doing it. And what researchers at the University of Michigan were able to figure out was if you go ahead and make a little ball out of aspirin, it's much easier said than done. It's actually really complex engineering to develop one of those. There's a lot of IP around that. But if you can make aspirin into a little ball that you can inject into the bloodstream, your immune cells will actually selectively gobble this thing up. They'll eat that before they eat anything else. And if you've ever taken an aspirin before, you know it essentially tones down inflammation, turns immune cells off. So imagine giving a really, really high dose of aspirin to your immune cells and how rapidly that could turn off parts of your immune response, and do it for just in a short period of time. Aspirin doesn't normally last that long in the body. Eventually gets kind of chewed up and removed. And so if you really wanted to turn off one of these cytokine storms, the hypothesis was, could you give people little balls of aspirin basically and turn those immune cells off? And lo and behold, I mean, it sounds like a crazy hypothesis, but they tested this out at first, obviously in smaller animals and ultimately in larger animals, and they found that actually you give an animal acute respiratory distress, or actually any number of very, very severe conditions where they get a cytokine storm, and little balls of aspirin works better than most other things that are out there. Works a lot better than steroids, works a lot better than just taking aspirin, because you're not actually targeting it to these cells. And so it's something that we're actually in the process of getting ready to take into human studies now. And in a really scaled up way. It took a long time to master all of the manufacturing and get to that point. But it's a little bit of a fun story. It really started with saying, looking at how these cells look and comparing it to a video game and saying, could we actually design some really clever science around this and actually solve a major human health problem? So anyway, thought that would be a fun one. It's one of our more fun investments. I know therapeutics typically is something that is relatively inaccessible to a lot of investors, and a lot of times the very intuitive, simple things are actually some of the best innovations in science. I mean, people will even tell you sometimes repurposing drugs or finding ways to do things that are more clever than brilliant have been some of the ways we've solved some of the biggest scientific challenges. Penicillin, for example, is founded off of kind of moldy cheese. So it's kind of incredible how opportunistic sometimes you have to be in drug discovery.
Should we see if anybody has any questions? And we're actually at the end of the time. We're supposed to be going to the breakouts. Does anybody have any questions before we do that? No? Yeah.
How much are you investing in preventative health? Because these are all reactive health. So where's preventative health? Because everything starts from a much larger scale, and what influences all what's happening with us to get to that stage where we need meditation. So what's happening with us?
Sure. I'd say first off, an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure, right? Maybe the high-level summary. There's certainly a lot of money at this day and age going into vaccines and other forms of treatment like that. I'd say that the challenge there is a lot of the diseases we're trying to grapple with now, like forms of cancer, like autoimmune diseases, like genetic diseases. You really can't use vaccines as a solution necessarily to those. But for a lot of other things like infectious disease, a lot of things that are more transmittable you acquire over a lifetime, there is a big push. I mean, it's actually where a lot of the RNA and even genetic studies are going, is how do we actually prevent some of the worst afflictions, or at least prevent them from getting worse before they actually get really bad, and hopefully prevent more people from getting things like sepsis. So certainly a big area of research, an area close to my heart too. So if we have time for more stories, we can talk offline about preventative things we're working on.
Come join our 361 firm community of investors and thought leaders. We have a lot of events created by the community as we collaborate on investments and philanthropic interests. Join us.